Okay, we're going to begin just a few things about chapter 2, which I liked, called the Grindstone. There's Bo again. Hey, baby. Say hi. Say hi. He's been a good boy. Anyway, the Grindstone, probably as far as imagery goes, this is one of the biggest images that we see in all of this book. The Grindstone, which hopefully you did a little bit of research on it, about what the grindstone is. Think of it like a whetstone, which you learned about last year with when you were doing, I think, the etymology of the word paragon. So, a grindstone is a huge rock used for sharpening tools. Sit down, Bob. Sit down. And so, if we think of this in terms of the French Revolution, if you have this huge rock, which was in this case across the street from the Monseigneur's mansion, you have this mob mentality, which I talked about in the chapter before. These people who are going over to sharpen their sharpen their swords and their weaponry in order to carry out their goals for the revolution. So, the grindstone is definitely a hellish type of image. And if you were to read the book, you understand that we have this mob mentality that's acting very animalistic and instinctual. And you have them gather around, especially at night, and you have that sound of the metal hitting the rock, and grunts and chants and singing and dancing around this fountain and this rock. You get to start to see the energy that is starting to ensue from the revolution. So just a couple of important areas of this chapter, because what's really important here as well is we get to see Dr. Manette transform. So we've seen him from the beginning of the book, very weak, sickly. He's been in prison for so long. He gets, quote unquote, recalled to life. He gets his life back, goes back to England with his daughter, becomes the physician, finds out about Darnay and his name, and he becomes transfixed on making shoes. So we see him going back and forth between his past and his present. Well, in this chapter, we get to see him use his past as strength. And there are many passages in this book, and some of the questions that you were to answer asked you to look at Christian imagery. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So if you turn your books to page 260, because we now have Lucy and Dr. Manette in France. So Lucy now understands a little bit more about the husband that she married. It's good that she finally learns that the man that she married is being held prisoner. But if you look at the top of page 260, and there is Mr. Lorry is looking at Dr. Manette in Paris. And it says, the doctor turned with his hand upon the fastening of the window and said with a cool, bold smile. So this strength, he gets his inner strength. He's among these people that are acting so instinctual, and he's there, and he gets this courage or this strength and this pride. And it says, my dear friend, I have a charmed life in this city. I have been a Bastille prisoner. There is no patriot in Paris. In France, who, knowing me to have been a prisoner in the Bastille, would touch me, except to overwhelm me with embraces or carry me in triumph. My old pain has given me a power that has brought us through the barrier and gained us news of Charles there and brought us here. I knew it would be so. I knew I could help Charles out of danger. I told Lucy so. And then he goes on a little bit. So he is relating his troubles and his PTSD, quite frankly, from being a prisoner in the Bastille to now bring that power to the people. So like, trust me, I've been here, I understand your anger. And then we move on I'm going to move on a little bit to page 262, because we're going to still talk about Dr. Manette. And if you go down to the first full, or the second full paragraph, where it says, Dr. Manette pressed his hand, hastened bareheaded out of the room, and was in the courtyard when Mr. Lorry regained the blind. And then just visualizes My dog is driving me crazy, sorry. His streaming white hair, his remarkable face, and the impetuous confidence of his manner as he put the weapons aside like water carried him in an instant to the heart of the concourse of the stone, in this case, the grindstone. For a few moments there was a pause, and a hurry, and a murmur, and the unintelligible sound of his voice. And then Mr. Lorry saw him, surrounded by all, and in the midst of a line of 20 men long, all linked shoulder to shoulder and hand to shoulder, hurried out with cries of, "Live the Bastille prisoner! Help for the Bastille prisoners, Kindred and La Force! Room for the Bastille prisoner in front there! Save the prisoner Evermont at La Force!" And 1,000 answering shouts. So we see him acting kind of like a Moses figure here. He's parting the weapons. He's parting the chaos aside, like Moses parted the Red Sea, as told in the Old Testament. So he's very godlike. He's gaining this strength, and people are listening to him. And so at the very end of this chapter, or at the end of this passage, we see that this mob that had been so bestial and devilish and hellish, grinding their weapons, now they want to save the prisoner because of Dr. Manette's influence. So it's just interesting how he has transformed into this weak, old, shriveled up man to somebody that is actually creating a calm and a fraternity, to use their words, in the people, and out by the grindstone. And so that's what I want you to think about with Dr. Manette as we move forward. The next thing I do want to look at is this idea of the grindstone and just the language that Dickens uses. So if you go back to page 261, it's basically the first 2 paragraphs. And just think of all the alliteration. And then like the grindstone. So this huge rock had a double handle. And turning at it madly were 2 men whose faces, as their long hair flapped back when the whirlings of the grindstone brought their faces up, were more horrible and cruel than the visages of the wildest savages in their most barbarous disguise. False eyebrows and false mustaches were stuck upon them, and their hideous countenances were all bloody and sweaty and all awry with howling, and all staring and glaring with beastly excitement and want of sleep. As these ruffians turned and turned, their matted locks, now flung forward over their eyes, now flung forward back over their necks. Some women held wine to their mouths that they might drink, and what with dropping blood, and what with dropping wine, and what with a stream of sparks struck out of the stone, all their wicked atmosphere seemed gore and fire. The eye could not detect one creature in the group free from the smear of blood. Shouldering one another to get next at the sharpening stone were men stripped to the waist with the stain all over their limbs and bodies, men in all sorts of rags and the stain upon those rags, men devilish set off with spoils of women's lace and silk and ribbon, with the stain dyeing those trifles through and through. Hatchets, knives, bayonet, swords, all brought to be sharpened, were all red with it. Some of the hacked swords were tied to the wrists of those who carried them with strips of linen and fragments of dress, ligatures, various in kind, but all deep of one color, red. And as the frantic wielders of these weapons snatched them from the stream of sparks and tore away into the streets, the same red hue was red in their frenzied eyes, eyes which any unbrutalized beholder would have given 20 years of life to petrify with the well-directed gun. So we see this maddening mob, this bloody, this gory, this besmearing of people in this frenzy. And then later on, of the passage I just read about Dr. Manette, he walks through and he calms it all down. So just think about this power that he now has. It's just beautiful. The very last page, 263, the last paragraph, which Dickens does a great job pretty much with every chapter. He ends it with something beautiful. It says, "The great grindstone, earth, had turned when Mr. Lorry looked out again, and the sun was red on the courtyard. But the lesser grindstone stood alone there in the calm morning air with a red upon it that the sun had never given and never would take away." So who is this lesser Grindstone? So think about that. Is it Minette? What's going on here? So I want you to just think about this as the tension and the plot and the climax of the story is picking up. We're seeing a transformation. We saw Darnay become the prisoner. Now we see Minette become the savior to a certain extent. So think about that as far as Christian imagery. Keep sending me questions. I'll have more discussion boards coming up with the latter chapters, but hopefully this helps, and let me know if you have any questions. See ya.